Morning, morning all. So I am John Campbell and a teacher training advisor, and with me I've got Jane Wilkinson, who is an early engagement advisor, and we're going to talk to you about applying to be a teacher and what it's like to be a teacher. I'm going to hand over to Jane to start our presentation.
Hello, everybody. So, the kind of things that we're going to cover today are what kind of reasons people look to get into teaching, what the role consists of, what kind of progression you can make with a career within teaching, and what kind of thing goes on away from the classroom. And for anybody who thinks that actually teaching is a fantastic option for me, then what kind of advice and support is available to you. So, one of the things that is really crucial to thinking about getting into teaching is why you may want to do that. Now, the rewards of a teaching career can be plentiful, but for every individual, it is very, very different. The reasons for wanting to get into teaching and the rewards that we find once we're in a teaching career. So, in terms of the reasons for me getting into teaching, my passion, if you like, was led very much by the want to help people with special educational needs. And so, therefore, I was able to find training opportunities to allow me to work in a school with children with hearing impairments. But that is very, very different for everybody. So, John, what kind of things prompted your initial research into getting into teaching?
That's a complicated question, Jane. I was just thinking I was thinking back to the days when I was at school, and I always was the kid that, particularly, I don't know if I want to say maths, but particularly in maths lessons, I used to help other kids, and it was always a passion of mine to just sort of actually teach kids, and so it was a natural. It seemed quite natural for me to actually apply to be a teacher and to go into teaching, and I've done 25 years as a teacher. So that's the route I took into teaching.
I think one of the things that we hear regularly when we're working with undergraduate students in particular is the fact that other people have spotted that potential for becoming a teacher because they've been helpful within the degree. And that was certainly one of the things that I ended up being prompted by. A friend of mine was dyslexic while we was doing our studying, and so I would help her with her essays, and she ended up getting much better grades than I. But the actual assistance that I was able to provide her and the kind of constant feedback from her saying, "Oh, you'd be a lovely teacher," even though I didn't quite believe her at that time, I think that was certainly something that planted a seed. But the other thing that I really enjoyed about the classroom was certainly the way that the career that I ended up developing was very, very varied, very adaptable, and therefore no two days were actually the same. So moving on, what kind of daily twists and turns you have in a classroom? I think one of the things that John's mentioned is that he had a passion, particularly for his subject, and was able to inspire others to be quite interested in what it was that he had to teach as well. So what was it about science, John, that you really enjoyed teaching? What were the kind of wow lessons that you tend to teach?
Um, I think I think science is a bit of a gift of a subject in order to it's an exciting subject. Usually when you say to kids, I always remember my year 7 lessons at the start of the year, the start of the term, and you just say, right, we're going to get the Bunsen burners out, and the kids were so excited, and it was quite a strange thing that that they'd never ever, they'd never done like a science lesson, never been with Bunsen burners, because in primary school, there wasn't usually a science lab. So when they came to me in a secondary school, they'd just be like, they're just extremely excited to do practical work. And so to me, it is the most exciting sort of lesson where you can actually explore and discover, and you've got all the whiz bangs. So yeah, let's all teach science.
Wouldn't that be wonderful? So I think that was the same for me as a design and technologist. I would go from baking cakes in the morning to doing a little bit of woodwork and cutting dovetail joints in the afternoon, doing a little bit of electronics, and then perhaps a finish off the day with some graphic design. So I think the variety, certainly within our careers, has really inspired us to kind of stay within that teaching profession for many, many years. So the other thing that is sometimes overlooked is the way that the teacher almost becomes a celebrity in their own right within their local community. We know the children, we know their parents, we know their cousins, their aunties sometimes, and various other people, and so it becomes quite difficult to walk around Tesco's without somebody bumping into you and saying, "Oh, hi, miss, hi, sir." And I think that's something that is easy to overlook. But ultimately, as a teacher, we are role models, and we need to behave as a professional in a school environment or a school community. And I think that does extend outside of the school day quite often. So one of the things that you are assessed by during a teacher training course is by the QTS standards or the teacher's standards, and part of that is being a professional and kind of role modeling the types of behaviour that you're expecting, and also putting things like sanctions in place for behaviour that's not necessarily going to be acceptable to you or to the wider school community. One of the biggest things I think is, as a teacher, is you are constantly building strong working relationships, not just with your class, but with colleagues, with parents, with other professionals such as social workers perhaps. And so therefore this is another aspect of teaching that can really be overlooked when people are considering getting into teaching. Is there anything within being a role model or a teaching professional that you would like to add with that one, John?
Well, I was just thinking that I get lots of questions from candidates where they worry about behavior in school of students. And what I would say is that the thing that you've hit on there is about relationships. And if you build good relationships with students and staff, just like probably in any workplace, but that's where you can be very successful. And actually, I would say that students generally, almost 99 to 100% of them, they come into school wanting to learn, and they don't wake up in the morning thinking, right, I'm going to misbehave today. They actually want to come in school to learn, and it's something that I would not worry about, is what I wanted to stress. I would say that developing good relationships, good working relationships with students will get you a long way, and they'll want that. No one wants to be shouted at, but people do want to be praised. And so praise, good relationships, and you'll go a long way, and you will be an excellent role model and professional. And just finally, QTS standards, it's if you're interested in applying to be a teacher, look at the QTS standards, because that's the list of things that you have to tick off in order to complete your teacher training course.
I think you're absolutely right. People are often apprehensive about managing behaviour in a school setting, particularly if you're not long after graduating. So you're not there's not a very big age difference between you and some of the students who you may be teaching, but the teacher training courses are there absolutely to be able to teach you how to manage that behaviour and how to as John says, set up those clear expectations, those clear boundaries, so that actually you're able to manage that successfully. So, teachers' working week. So I think we've reiterated that there's no 2 days are alike, but therefore it does become quite difficult to plan for what might happen and kind of take into account those things that kind of pop out of the blue. So, for example, a friend of mine who's teaching at the moment had a very upset student come to him last thing on a Friday a couple of weeks ago because they'd had a bereavement within the family, and so my friend actually ended up working with this young person for at least an hour after school, which was totally unplanned for, but it was absolutely imperative that they ended up doing this. And actually, the relationship that's been built as a result of that is important. And David, the friend, has said to me it was an absolute privilege for this child to be able to kind of open up about something that they've not been able to for a long time. So things like that do pop up very, very unexpectedly within your working week. So it can be quite difficult to plan for those key priorities that you absolutely must do, particularly when there's things that will come out of the blue and kind of upset the plans that you've made. What kind of ways did you find helpful, John, in terms of managing your workload and your key priorities for the working week?
Yeah, so I was just thinking there that when you're planning lessons, and I always say this to the students that I mentor, that if you've got an hour's lesson and you're planning it and you've now spent an hour planning it, then stop, because you can't you can't you can't balance the time doing that. The other thing, of course, is don't reinvent the wheel, which actually is something you always say to me, Jane. so I've maybe stolen your line there, but basically there's loads of materials out there, and you've got teams working together in schools. And you've got resources that you can adapt, and you don't have to make every single last thing up for your lessons. And so yeah, always I wouldn't say steal, but borrow resources from everyone. Actually, that's what the slide says. It says borrow, which is probably more appropriate. So yeah, I think that's definitely ways forward. And then the other thing that comes to mind is don't give up anything that brings you joy to your life. So for instance, if you play the guitar in your spare time, or if you like to go walking, then don't stop doing those things. Make time for yourself, your soul, your social life, so that you're actually not working solid 24/7. Because the thing about teaching, and probably for many things in many jobs, especially new jobs that you start, you can spend hours and hours doing planning a lesson to the finite most exact detail. And the point is, you can only do so much, so you need to be very strict about your time management, prioritizing exactly what you want to teach, focusing on teaching that and really making sure that you do have a balance of work and social life. And my one of my colleagues used to say to me,
Oh, it sounds like we've lost John. We may never know what his colleagues actually said to him.
do you know what? It clicked off. Sorry there. Yeah, I was just going to say, my colleague used to say to me, Mark often, little and often. So basically make sure you keep on top of the admin and things like that. And I'll stop there, and I'll make sure that my mute's okay.
So absolutely, John did steal my line there. The don't reinvent the wheel is absolutely imperative. Don't try to do like I did, create and manufacture every single resource PowerPoint worksheet, make it look super duper branded, because actually it's not about the actual worksheets and the way that they look, it's the content within that. And working with others, networking with people who you study with, people who you then go on to work with, is actually the way that you manage your time effectively. And I think the other thing that particularly people who are quite new to the profession need to learn quite quickly is how to say no to the requests that will be made of you and of your time. So it's very, very tempting to take on everything and anything. Oh, there's a new after school club going, who would like it? You know, it's often a new teacher or a beginner teacher putting their hand up and wanting to get involved, and that's all well and good, but you've got to be careful about not taking on too much and actually realizing when that kind of critical point is between the work and the life balance is. And actually once you've hit that kind of maximum level, that you then not saying, oh yes, I will do this extra piece of work, or I will plan this extra lesson for you, etc. So it's learning to say no is a lesson that I struggled to learn, and reinventing the wheel was my kind of MO until I learned that actually it's really really silly thing to do. So in terms of career progression, I think we've both had a career that has progressed in different kinds of ways, and I think there's different experience are representative of how schools and leadership roles work, in as much as I never envisaged where I would kind of go to in terms of my career. And I don't know if that's necessarily the same for John. But John, can you just explain what kind of steps you had in terms of your career progression, please?
Yeah, so I basically, as I said, I started out as a science teacher. It was a bit of a traditional role, so I worked up to be a head of science in my next step, and then sciencey, mathsy types like me went down the sort of assistant head route for data, and a deputy head route for timetabling, and that kind of route was one of my main routes that I did through teaching. I did have other bits and pieces on the side as well, but that was my main sort of progression as I went from science teacher up to deputy head, with the sort of mathsy, data-y side of things, timetabling. But the world is your oyster, because I have done various other routes and roles in my career. So, for instance, I was a work experience coordinator at one point. I've been a line manager for every subject and every year group. I have been a pastoral deputy, so yeah. So there are so many things you can do in terms of progression, but yeah. So it's never boring. That's what I would say.
Absolutely, and I think that was very much the kind of options that I found. So I quite quickly headed up on PSHE for the whole school shortly after my NQT period, which is newly qualified period. Then I was always the SEN or special educational needs lead within my department of design and technology. I very soon kind of became seconded to the SEN department, so was working with children with English as an additional language, and led on that even, to the extent that there's quite a number of Afghan children running around South London with a Yorkshire accent now. And then there was I was able to become a head of deputy head of year and a deputy head of house, and then I ended up going down the curriculum route and became a head of art and design. And so therefore the kind of progression that you make can be quite varied, depending on what you're interested in and what kind of things you find worth getting up for each day. So the other kind of part of teaching that it's very seldom looked at would be the kind of work that you do away from the classroom. And so while some of this can be planning and marking and that kind of thing, so very much linked to the classroom, there's many other opportunities outside of the classroom as well. And again, it often extends that opportunity of building those relationships with both your peers, your colleagues, but also with the children with whom you're working. And this was very apparent to me when I joined the combined cadet unit within my school. So it was an after school club that I ended up participating in, and as a result I became a commissioned officer with the RAF. So I was a pilot officer, and so the children whom I was teaching were calling me mom and saluting me, usually on a Wednesday afternoon, but also the kind of respect within the classroom actually rose quite considerably. And in the corridors, it's not just within the classroom. You're a teacher around a school site, and so therefore in the classroom or in the corridors or in the lunch hall or in the assembly hall, that kind of thing, the attitude from the students actually changed quite dramatically when I started working with them in that kind of after school club. And the other thing that I really enjoyed doing was the film club. So we would have DVDs brought in. The children who attended would choose which film that we would watch. We would do a little bit of analysis of what had gone on within those films. But basically, it was somewhere for a rainy Tuesday afternoon for the kids to come and sit down somewhere warm if it was a horrible day, watch a film and just be able to relax in each other's company, and have a discussion that was based on what we've just watched. But ultimately it was just a nice thing to do, and that was some of the things that I actually enjoyed quite considerably. What about you, John?
Well, I was just thinking back to early days of my career when I took a 36-hour journey on a coach with students to Italy for a ski trip, which definitely deepened my relationship with students on that coach. It was surprisingly not as bad as it sounds. We did actually have a really good ski trip. It was really tiring, but very enjoyable, and it did set up some really good relationships with students and staff. So I remember that thoroughly. I think I was telling you the other day, wasn't I, that I used to run a few societies, like an origami club society, but I did say to you it folded, didn't I? And you thought that wasn't a very good joke.
No, it's still in.
But it was true. I did run an origami society, and then a colleague of mine who was very busy. It always reminds me about him, because he wanted to do a guitar club after school, and he said, but he's really busy, and I just said, well, why don't you give it a go, because it's really good to develop some sort of relationships with students that's outside of your subject. And he always said to me it was the best thing he ever did, because it was very different, because he used to teach a very different subject, and it just allowed him to actually have a very different and a more informal relationship that really supported his learning, teaching within his lessons. So again, I think it enriches the soul, and shows that teachers aren't just putting cupboards after school as well, which some students think. And you know that we're definitely more human, and so that's really good. And obviously, if you're into sport, then you know there's always the PE departments. They can never get enough of people that run school clubs, because as you can imagine, they have to have maybe a boys club and a girls club if it's a mixed school, but then they have to a year 7, a year 8, a year 9, or year 1, a year 2, a year 3. So you know there's you can never have too many sports team people doing things as well. So loads and loads of ways of deepening relationships between students and staff.
My students were utterly convinced that I actually lived in the cupboard that adjoined my classroom, because they weren't allowed into the cupboard, not for any other reason that I didn't want them to steal the stuff that I was storing in there, but they always felt that it was my actual home, and I probably led them to believe that it possibly was. So in terms of the advice and support that's available for anybody who's looking to get into teaching, we have people like ourselves, John and I, who work with people throughout their application. So I'm part of the early engagement team that work primarily with undergraduate students in years 1 and 2 of their degree, and looking to apply for teacher training courses in 2022 or 2023. We work with people to really expose their skills when it comes to a teaching career. So we work on things like their communication or presentation skills. We work on their empathy or emotional intelligence. We work on getting better at interviews or any other kind of cross transferable skill that you could have both within a classroom setting, but also potentially in any other career, because obviously people in their first or their second year are just thinking about teaching. They're not kind of always absolutely definitely decided on that. But we also help in terms of preparing for writing personal statements and for going ahead and making an application if people would choose to. John, on the other hand, very much works with people who are looking to apply currently or within this current recruitment cycle. So can you explain a little bit about the teacher training advisors, John?
Yeah, I think you've kind of covered most things there, but basically, yeah, as Jane says, the cycle is open now and runs throughout this year, ready for you to apply this year, so you start next year as a someone in teacher training, and I think both sets of advisors, I think our biggest strength is that we've all taught. So when when you've got these worries about what's it like in a classroom, what's it like doing the planning, what's it like doing the interview, we've lived all that, so we know what it's like. We can answer all those questions. When you get an interview and it says plan a lesson, and you're thinking, I've never planned a lesson in my life. We've done thousands and thousands of lessons, and so as experienced teachers, we will help you through the entire process from start to finish to get onto a teacher training course and to join the world of teaching somewhere in England, and having that qualification to teach anywhere in the world that recognizes the QTS, which is a worldwide qualification that's recognized all over the place. Are you on mute, Jane?
Yes. So we have additional kind of support in terms of the advisors, but also there's quite a lot of presence on various different social media options. So there's Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. We do have a couple of closed groups within Facebook. That's the Aspiring Teachers Forum and the Change Careers to Teaching, where myself and John and other colleagues would help people with any questions that they've got in that kind of forum. But also, because there's I think 16,000 people in one of those groups, there's also that kind of peer-to-peer support, and it's very, very positive in nature rather than the negative. But additionally, if you want a quick question, we've got the web chat facility, and we have got the teaching line that you can speak to us on, and that's on that number that's there. So if you if you search for Get Into Teaching, then our website will pop up. You can register and receive information by using the QR code featured here. So you would be able to receive emails about how to better your application and how to be able to go through an application by scanning this QR code. But if you want to have an advisor, you can also register through the website. That's everything that we've got to say. So I think we're going to open up the presentation for any questions that anybody may have.
I was just going to add one thing we didn't say at the end there, was that our service is totally free. You know, they say that nothing in life is free, but in fact, we are. How exciting is that?
Good. Very nice way to end that. So thank you very much, John and Jane. Really insightful and great to hear about your own experiences. So hello, everyone who's listening in. My name is Ali and I'm from Rate My Placement. Thank you very much for joining us at the Essential Careers virtual event. So yeah, my job is to ask you some questions. So there's been a good amount of questions coming through on the stage chat. So thank you all of you who've put your questions in. And I've got some myself as well that I've been really intrigued to know about from what you've been saying. But given that the audience has been so kind to ask some questions, we'll start off there, shall we? So the first one that I've seen was, and there's actually a couple around this topic. The first one I've seen was from Vonnie, so thank you very much, Vonnie. She asked about experiences with children with SEND, so special educational needs and disabilities, and how do you guys work with such a student population? So Jane, I know you mentioned your experiences there, so do you want to kick us off with that one?
Yeah, so my route into teaching was very much prior to that, I'd worked in mental health units, and so had that kind of pre-existing interest in kind of mental health and people who had learning needs or specific learning needs or disabilities. And so I was kind of in a position where actually I thought, oh, well, I'll become an educational psychologist. And in order to do that, I would need to have QTS, the qualified teacher status. So when I was looking at getting into teaching, I was able to find a provider that was able to put me into an SEND school that had a particular unit for children with hearing impairment. And then in my second placement, it was a very, very comprehensive school with children of all various different needs. And I think one of the things that teacher training sets people up to be being very good at, even if it's not a specialist SEND course, you very, very quickly realise how to differentiate tasks so that people with different learning abilities and different learning needs are able to access what it is that you're teaching them. And I ended up within my career going and working in alternative provision. So we found within the pupil referral unit that I ended up working in, there was children with many, many different types of additional needs, but it wasn't that I'd necessarily had loads and loads of training within that, because that was different from somebody perhaps who was just being a normal kind of day-to-day teacher in their subject area, because I think teacher training in general does teach you to be able to cater for everybody's different learning needs.
Thanks. It seems like Amy on the chat's really interested in working with children from SEND as well. So she's asked, what sort of scenarios did you face when you were working with children with special educational needs and disabilities?
One of the great things that I did the PGCE element to the teacher training course as well, and so therefore my provider with whom I worked was very, very good at allowing us to do the research into areas that we was actually really interested in. So part of the 2 of the assignments that I actually completed was research into the autistic spectrum disorders and ways of catering for children with SEND. So I would create resources that were specific for children with dyslexia, for example, and then try it out with some of the children and kind of evaluate how well those kind of resources worked. So I think it's important to just be mindful of things like getting the right typeface, for example. So there's a typeface called Open Dyslexic that's available free to schools and to teachers to create resources so that it's very, very easily legible for young people who struggle to access the written word. But having having empathy for people with SEND, I think, is quite vital to being able to teach these people well. And also, I think knowing when to ask for help, because all schools have an SEND department within them, and the teaching assistants and the SENCA that work within that will know these children incredibly well. And I think it's absolutely vital to just get to know how everybody who you're working with just ticks, and it then makes it quite easy to be able to meet the different needs of the different students.
Thank you. Yeah, all about, I guess, building relationships with students and really understanding them, as you were saying in the presentation. Thank you very much for that. Brings us nicely onto another question as well. So thank you very much for Lisa on this one. So I'm guessing the transition from university life to being in the classroom is potentially quite a big one, and there's all the different lessons you need to learn and plan that you were talking about. So Lisa says, great question. What advice would you give about handling the stresses of what sounds like a lot of new experiences and juggling the tasks and multitasking? So as a new teacher, what advice would you give? Maybe John, one for you.
Yeah, I was just thinking there. It's that crucial thing about maintaining the balance between work and your own social life. You know, making sure that if you've got something that you like to do. I used to like to play squash when I was young and fit. No need to say anything. But yeah, so I used to always make sure that I had my sort of regular squash game, and in fact I introduced it as a little ladder in school with some of the staff, so that you actually have that side of things. In any job, I think when you start, whatever job you go to, when you leave university, I think you can do it full on. You can do it 24/7, and it's just healthy to make sure that you actually are strict with your time, and that you give it the time to do well at it, but then you stop and you do something to feed your soul, to look after your mental health, and to have outside stuff going on, outside of school, so that you maintain a sort of perspective of life and social life and family life and that kind of thing.
That's very useful. And what sort of hours would you expect someone who's recently into the teaching profession to work in the early few years? I guess alongside marking and the extracurricular activities that you talked about as well.
Well, I think the advantage of school is, people know that school kind of runs from about 8 till about 4 or something like that. If you want to choose to then go home at that, outside of those hours and do your planning at home, then you can do that, or you can do it at school. I found that basically they're the core hours, but you'd have to spend a few hours additionally to do your planning and your marking. And whether you chose to do that straight after school, in the evening, at the weekends, during the holidays, that was up to you when you did it. But I would say that you should be quite strict with yourself in terms of, you've got those hours. I don't know, a normal job would be sort of 8 till 5, 8 till 6, would it not be? Something like that. So you're keeping those same hours, but maybe you're just being a little bit flexible in terms of when you want to do them. I found that I prefer to sort of come home, do a few bits and pieces, and maybe work a bit later in the evening, and that worked better for me.
I think for me as well, you get better at it like over time, so your planning becomes much less, your marking becomes quicker because you're not having to look back at the what the levels would look like, and so you do get quicker with everything. And one of the things that's I think good within your teaching course and then within your newly qualified teaching year is that you're not teaching as much as an experienced teacher. So you've got a reduction on your timetable, and actually putting this, being quite strict with yourself and saying, well, rather than kind of just going and sitting in the office and playing a bit of solitaire or something, I'm actually going to mark these books in school because I've got a non-contact time where I'm not actually physically teaching the children. I've got this kind of free time. I'm going to use the hour and actually use it purposefully and do that marking or do that planning. But it is quite easy to kind of be in a position where you think, oh, I'll just have a sit down and a cup of tea, and somebody will come into the staff room and you'll have a little chat, and then that hour's gone or wasted. It's important to try and avoid doing that, I think. And the other thing that I became quite good at was actually marking the work within the lesson. So I would have the children come up to me, and I would go through whatever it was that they had completed and say, right, this is great, this is, this is how you make this better. And so therefore I wasn't having to sit just with the books and go through it. I was actually able to have a conversation with those children at that point, and they actually wrote up the feedback themselves. So kind of, little teacher hacks were developed over the course of the career, if you like.
Nice, top tips. Yeah, I guess like anything, after you've had a bit more experience at it, you know where and when you can be more effective with your time, shall we say. Awesome. Right, just conscious of time, only got 2 minutes or so left, and there's been, I think, maybe 3 questions come in talking about the transition from university and the subjects they're studying at uni into then how that relates to what they can teach at school. So Victoria says she's a legal graduate who's interested in science. Lena is a biomedical student. So they're all just talking about that kind of what they need to consider and what they need to do to figure out what subject they actually want to go on to teach. So what recommendations would you give there?
Is that me? Okay.
Yeah,
I was just gonna say it depends on your background. So for instance, the teaching providers will look at your degree, they'll look at the units of your degree, what's called the transcript, they'll look at your A-level grades. If you've got a good A-level grade, A, for instance, in a subject that you're particularly interested in, they'll look at those things. And it's really a case of, I would say at this point, it'd be good for you to get a teacher advisor so they could look more exactly at it, because we've got literally 20 seconds left or whatever. But definitely, definitely the world is your oyster. If you've got a degree, you can do primary. If you've got a degree and you want to do a certain subject in secondary, then they'll look at your transcripts, they'll look at your A levels, and there are courses that you can be funded to do as well. But yeah, get an advisor just to sort of personalize that answer.
Thank you so much, John. I think that is time, unfortunately. So there was a couple of questions, maybe more site-specific ones that we didn't have time to cover, unfortunately. John and Jane's colleague Alex, I believe, is in the booth, and so he's waiting for them to join. Hopefully John and Jane can join in the booth at some point as well. So if we didn't have a chance to answer your question, please go and ask specifically in there. But that just leaves me to say thank you so much, John and Jane. Really appreciate your time and your insight. That was very, very useful. And thanks to all of you who asked some questions on the chat. So we'll be back in around 15 minutes or so, and we'll be joined by Unlocked. So if anyone who's watching wants to hear about the work of a prison officer, please join us about 15 minutes or so. John and Jane, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. All the best.